Hello, welcome once again to Lehto's Law. I'm Steve Lehto. George sent me a link and said, Steve, you know that they always talk about the first person to do something. You go down in history as the first person to do something, and it's kind of a cool thing usually, right? Well, he sent me one. This guy might not want to be remembered as having been the first person to do this, but in 1897, on this date, September 10th, when I'm shooting this video, 1897, a 25-year-old London taxi driver named George Smith became the first person ever arrested for drunk driving. So the first drunk driving arrest occurred when George Smith slammed his cab into a building. Now, again, 1897, so you have to think about the automobiles they had back then. And he ran his car into a building. Now, you have to understand back then, buildings were hard to avoid. Smith pleaded guilty and was fined 25 shillings. Now, it doesn't say here what he pled guilty to. And the story is coming from History.com. And of course, History.com is affiliated with the History Channel. And if you don't know this, the History Channel is a channel on cable where they specialize in ancient aliens and cursed gold. They used to actually cover things having to do with history, but they've moved on. I have a degree in history along with my law degree, and I don't remember studying ancient aliens or cursed gold. But times have changed. I went to school a long time ago. I'm an old guy. In the United States, by the way, the first laws against operating a motor vehicle while under the influence of alcohol went into effect in New York in 1910. In 1936, Dr. Rolla Harger, a professor of biochemistry and toxicology, patented the Drunkometer. You know, when you make an invention, sometimes naming it makes a difference in how serious it'll be taken, right? The Drunkometer was a balloon-like device into which people would breathe to determine whether they were inebriated. It doesn't explain much more beyond that here. In 1953, Robert Borkenstein, a former Indiana State Police captain and university professor who had collaborated with Harger on the Drunkometer, invented the Breathalyzer. Now, doesn't that sound more serious? The Breathalyzer. The guy failed a breathalyzer test. Well, it's better than failing the Drunkometer test. So, it was easier to use and more accurate than the Drunkometer. The Breathalyzer was the first practical device and scientific test available to police officers to establish whether someone had too much to drink. A person would blow into the breathalyzer, and it gauges the proportion of alcohol vapors in the exhaled breath, which reflects the level of alcohol in the blood. And I'm sure someone's going to comment and say that's not correct. That is probably an oversimplification. But you do have to remember that in the old days, prior to the Drunkometer or the breathalyzer, basically what you would have to do is bring in testimony to say, yes, this person was drunk. And what does that testimony consist of? Descriptions, things that people saw. The guy hit a building. That's something, but that could happen when you're sober, you know. Although when I drove a tow truck, I've mentioned that I've towed vehicles that hit buildings and or other non-moving objects like telephone poles, rocks, berms, and so on. And there was almost always alcohol involved. I'm pretty sure there was actually always alcohol involved. And often a lot of alcohol involved. And I remember showing up, for instance, I've told the story before a couple times, about the fact that there is a road in Michigan called Greenfield Road, and it dead ends into a road called 14 Mile Road. And at that T-stop, there's a house over here that basically is a target for anybody who's coming down and doesn't realize that, you know, the road stops at 14. So the people here put a big rock in front of their house. It's like, hey, if you're going to hit something, hit the rock. And I got called out there one time because somebody had woken up or come to or, you know, looked up and realized that they're about to hit the rock, and they steered and they hit the house next door. And by the way, I've had people also point out, you can see the rock, Google Earth View, 14 Greenfield, Birmingham, Michigan. And so I remember getting to the scene of that accident and seeing the driver of the car stumbling around. At first I thought they were injured, and the cop just goes, no, she's drunk. Just way off the chart. Like, you know, she finished with a breathalyzer. Now the breathalyzer is drunk. So despite the invention of the breathalyzer and other developments, It was not until the late 1970s and early 1980s that the public awareness about the dangers of drinking and driving increased, and lawmakers and police officers began to get tougher on offenders. In 1980, a Californian named Candy Leitner founded Mothers Against Drunk Driving, or MAD, after her 13-year-old daughter, Carrie, was killed by a drunk driver while walking home from a school carnival. The driver had 3 previous drunk driving convictions and was out on bail from a hit-and-run arrest 2 days earlier. Leitner and MAD were instrumental in helping to change attitudes about drunk driving and pushed for legislation that increased the penalties for driving under the influence of alcohol and or drugs. MAD also helped get the minimum drinking age raised in many states. Today, the legal drinking age is 21 everywhere in the United States, and convicted drunk drivers face everything from jail time and fines to the loss of their driver's licenses and increased car insurance rates. Some drunk drivers are ordered to have ignition interlock devices installed in their vehicles. These devices require a driver to breathe into a sensor attached to the dashboard. The car won't start if the driver's blood alcohol concentration is above a certain limit. And we've talked about this before, that a judge can tell someone to stop driving. They'll often just go out and get in their car and drive home from court. So if you tell someone to never drink and drive, many people just go, I got out of court. Score. Let's go celebrate by getting drunk. We'll drive ourselves to the bar. Despite the stiff penalties and public awareness campaigns, drunk driving remains a serious problem in the United States. Each year, roughly 1,500 people die in alcohol-related crashes, and about 1.5 million people are arrested for driving under the influence of alcohol or drugs. But this goes back, like I said, to the first drunk driving arrest, George Smith in London, 1897. On this date, 1897, George Smith hit a building while apparently drunk and was convicted and fined 25 shillings. Getting back to what I said earlier, so you got arrested for drunk driving in the old days before the Drunkometer and the Breathalyzer. And if it was illegal in a jurisdiction, they would prove it by bringing in witnesses to describe what they saw. I saw the guy driving down the road weaving. Guy got out of the car and was stumbling around, Guy was glassy-eyed, slurring his speech, had an open thing of alcohol in his hand, I mean, whatever. And then a jury would, listen to that and come to the conclusion the guy was drunk operating the vehicle and he shouldn't have been, and he can get convicted for that. And one of the questions I often get asked about almost anything is people say, but Steve, how are they going to prove that? How are they going to prove that? How are they going to prove anything? And generally speaking, it's not like somebody can say, oh, was this person drunk or not? We can just go and check the internet. It's going to tell us, it tells us everything else, right? No, it's usually you got to have people come in and testify to what they saw. And if they saw things that tend to prove what someone's trying to prove, a jury can come to that conclusion. So, if you're facing a felony drunk driving charge, like say a third offense where someone got killed, if you blew a breathalyzer, that might come into evidence. If they drew blood, that might come into evidence. But it might also be there's a stack of witnesses coming in going, I saw the guy do this, I saw the guy do this, he stumbled around doing this. And that kind of evidence can then, come together and form the basis of a conviction like this. So I suspect that before the breathalyzer came along and the drunkometer was being used, there were probably a lot of cases where maybe not a lot of witnesses, maybe not a lot of good witnesses, and a lot of drunk drivers got away with stuff. And there were probably also cases, and I'm just being fair here, there were probably also cases where uncoordinated bad drivers got charged and convicted of drunk driving simply because guy had one drink or spilled alcohol on himself at the bar, got in an accident, and a cop goes, yeah, you reeked of beer. So those things could have happened also. So the interesting thing about breathalyzers and drunkometers and whatever other devices they have, it's like radar guns. If they're used properly, calibrated, and all of that, it actually makes things much clearer. Because if you ain't drunk, the breathalyzer should show that just as well as if you are drunk. The only real issue is what the level is, because they keep lowering the threshold as to how much alcohol you're allowed to have in your system. And nowadays, the amount of alcohol that you can have in your system legally and drive is so low that I am convinced that many people right at the threshold or right above the threshold, in other words, they're just over the limit where they shouldn't be driving. Most people, if you ask them at that moment in time, how do you feel? They go, I feel fine. I feel fine. Now, I'm not saying that means the threshold's wrong, nor am I saying these people can absolutely drive just as well as they could without the alcohol in their system. I'm really pointing out that I think a lot of people, especially in first offense drunk drivings, didn't think they were doing anything wrong. So, I always caution people as an attorney. I can tell you right now, I've handled drunk driving cases. I don't do them anymore. I haven't done any in a long time, but I used to handle quite a few of them. First offenses. I told people I don't do seconds. I don't do thirds. Back in the old days, thirds is you're going away. Nowadays, it's more common that you might not be off to prison. But there was a time when third offense drunk driving's, there's a good chance you're going to prison on a conviction. But in Michigan, but they've been lowering these thresholds over time, and I've met people from all walks of life who got some contact with the police, and it wasn't because they were weaving all over the road. It was they were speeding or whatever, some other innocuous reason to get pulled over, and then by the time the dust settles, they've blown a breathalyzer. They're a little bit over the limit, and it's a first offense drunk driving. And so, I have a little more sympathy for somebody who gets a first offense drunk driving where they just barely got over the limit. And I've met some fairly mature people. I've actually met people who'd been driving for 20 years, and it was the first contact they'd had with police while driving. In other words, never been pulled over in 20 years. First time they got pulled over, and they blew right above the limit. And I don't think that person got in the car thinking, oh, I'm drunk, but I'm going to get home. I mean, I don't think they thought that way. So, again, I'm not saying I have a lot of sympathy for drunk drivers. And you hear horrific stories about people who've done crazy things while drunk. And there was a story I followed a few years ago out of Florida where a guy was behind the wheel of a car while he had a ton of alcohol in his system, and he T-boned another car at an intersection, and it was right next to a canal, and the car that he T-boned went into the canal, and I forgot if it was one or more people in the car that drowned, and the guy just drove home. And somehow they piece the story together, and they find this smashed-in car at this guy's house. And then they figure out that, and there's a car in the canal with dead people in it, or dead person in it, And I mean, things like that. I mean, so don't get me wrong. I'm not defending drunk drivers. I'm simply saying I don't think many people understand where the threshold has gotten to over the years. But again, George Smith, gone down in history. I guess the good news is he's got a fairly common last name. So if you're descended from George Smith, you can just say, oh, no, it's a common name. But the 25-year-old London taxi driver on September 10th, 1897, hit a building while drunk driving and went down in history as the first drunk driving arrest. Thank you, George. Thank you, History.com. Questions or comments, put them below. Otherwise, talk to you later.